Think of it more as a survival guide from a native. Hello my fellow Tamrielites, welcome to the channel or welcome back. This video has 5 tips to help you beat NPCs at Tribute so you can finish Kishka's daily and get your purple reward bag without rage quitting. And I'm going to totally violate the rules of clickbait by giving you the list from the easiest to implement first and the more nuanced strategies at the end. And toward the end of the video, I have channel news to announce, so stay tuned for that. I just mentioned Kishka, and I want to emphasize, always be working on a daily from Kishka. Play those 3 games until you've won each round, even if it's over multiple days. Once you've got them, Kishka will give you a purple reward bag as a quest reward. You have a much better chance of getting the special rewards, including the music box lead, from that purple bag than you do from the green bags you'll get in the mail. I have gotten that lead from Kishka. It is possible. Lastly, I want to add that while these strategies will also help you against living players, I'm focusing specifically on playing novice-level NPCs with the base 8 decks only. My first suggestion begins at deck selection. Choose the Reach deck, the black deck, and use it throughout the game to aggressively destroy your weakest cards. If you struggle to beat NPCs and you don't play the black deck, learning to use it is by far my strongest recommendation to improve your game. The more comfortable you get destroying your cards, the more consistently you'll win against NPCs and players, because getting trash culled out of your hand so you have an entire deck of good cards to play ups your game immensely. The games running in the video while I talk illustrate the technique. Watch a second time with the audio off and focus on the card play. You'll see me destroying cards throughout the game in the video. My hands will get stronger and stronger not only because I'm buying good cards, but because I'm burning the weak ones too. In actual practice, what this means for you is that when looking at the tavern, you'll sometimes need to prioritize card destruction over something else you might want in your hand. When to choose which is definitely a balancing act, and I'll go into that balance more in a later tip, but I promised the simplest things first. So for now, just remember that as a rule, you want to destroy your 1 gold coin cards pretty much as fast as you can. That will take you a few hands, and while you're burning them, you'll be buying better cards, ones that generate gold for you in addition to doing other things. The fewer unsuited coin cards you have, the faster you will draw those better cards, and the more combos you'll get. Note, however, that when I say destroy the gold coin cards, I am not talking about swapping them out for the 2 gold writs from the bank patron. Yes, 2 gold is better than 1, and if that's absolutely all you can do, then by all means do that, but it should be the last thing you consider doing with your 2 gold in your patron turn. Because 2 gold is better than 1, but a 2 gold writ is not better than a 2 gold card from one of the suited decks that will also trigger a combo with other cards from that deck. The writs are handy in the beginning, I use them too, but you want to buy as few of them as possible, and as soon as you're done destroying all your gold coin cards, start burning the writs. The caveat here is that you do need some way to get new cards, so in the beginning you have to acquire cards that generate gold before you've destroyed the last of your coin cards. Then once you have other options, those coin cards are anchors you need to jettison as fast as possible. If you don't use the black deck and you don't destroy cards as you play, then you are probably using a number of techniques to manipulate your deck, like moving cards from the draw to discard piles. That is in fact the strength of the Sigil deck. But every single time you manipulate a useless card, that's a game action you've taken instead of doing something that strengthens your deck. You're treating the symptom instead of the problem, whereas if you destroy that weak card, you're done. But hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Watch how the NPCs play. Watch the games I'm running and see how often the NPC prioritizes a card in the tavern that destroys cards over one that generates power. It happens a lot. If you are losing to NPCs and you don't destroy your trash cards, that is the single biggest tool the NPCs are using to beat you that you can learn the fastest. Remember that you need to have cards that generate gold before you burn all the coins. When you kind of have the hang of that, try pushing it too far a few games. You'll probably find that the bar of destroying too many cards is way lower than you think. In truth, a 5-card deck is a winner if it's the right 5 cards. And that was the first tip. If any of that was helpful, consider subscribing to the channel or liking the video. I'm still new enough and small enough that every click makes a huge difference, and so does the fact that you're still watching this, so thanks for that too. I'll express my gratitude by moving on to my second tip, which is, you can look at the cards in all the draw, discard, and in-play piles on the board. You probably already know you can look at your own draw pile, and if you didn't, now you do. You can never see what order the cards are in, but you can always look to see, for example, how large a chance you have to draw a crow card. The same is true of your discard pile and the pile made from played cards. What you might not realize is that you can also look at your opponent's draw, discard, and in-play piles. If that seems bizarre or even unfair, just remember that the only secret about the cards is what order they'll fall in, and the interface doesn't show you that. You can know what cards are in each deck because each player starts the game with the same 10-card deck composed of the starter cards from each of the 4 patrons in play, plus 6 bank cards, which are the unsuited gold coin cards. Each player then sees the other buy cards, so the cards in the player's deck are never a mystery. Moreover, you can see what they have played and discarded, so that is never in doubt either. Since you know what's in the draw pile but not the order, you can't know which cards dealt from the draw pile to your opponent's hand. That would be an unfair advantage since it isn't something you can figure out just by watching the cards. Therefore, you'll notice that the interface conflates their draw pile and deck when you're looking at your opponent's card. There's a tab for their discards and another for their hand and draw pile together. Whereas when looking at your own deck, you have 3 tabs, with the hand and draw cards separate. Even though you can't know which specific cards are in your opponent's hand, when making a decision about what cards to buy, it can be helpful, especially in the beginning of the game, to check and see if there's even a chance that they can buy an expensive card from the tavern. The answer might be no. You can also look at the draw and discard piles for the tavern. It isn't terribly helpful in the beginning because it's all the cards, but when the pile gets lower, you can be useful to check and see if particular cards still have a chance of appearing for purchase. Remember, there's no time limit in a game with NPCs, so take a moment to look at a deck if future cards figure into your decision. In fact, take your time looking around the whole board and consider every option, not just the tavern. With tip number 3, we start getting more into the specific play strategies. This tip is to remember to use the patron abilities to your advantage and not let yourself get so focused on the tavern that you miss opportunities. Patron usage is one of the marked differences between playing an NPC and playing a live person. Players, even good ones, can be uneven about using patron abilities. Sometimes players just simply forget to use patrons, or they don't notice their opponent slowly achieving a patron victory. Players can also be aggressive about using a patron for reasons that have nothing to do with the game, like completing an achievement or maybe just because they like using it. And of course, by the same token, a living player can be inventive and clever with the use of patrons in ways that NPCs generally cannot be. By contrast, NPCs follow decision paths pretty consistently. I'm recording this in January 2024, and one of the updates in 2023 made the NPCs a lot smarter and more aggressive about using patrons. It used to be that winning via patron turns was fairly simple, but that is no longer the case. It seems to me overall that the more you use patrons and approach patron victories in a game, the more that NPC will use those tactics against you. In any case, patron wins are now challenging to achieve against NPCs. So here are pointers for using each of the base patrons in games, specifically with NPCs. First up is the Pelin patron, which costs 2 power and moves an agent from your discard pile to your draw pile. While it is possible for this deck to be useful, I have used it. Remember how I said in the first tip that if you're playing the black deck and destroying trash cards, deck manipulation becomes not just less important, but actually a waste of a game action? Here is an example. Yes, it can be useful, but if your deck is lean and strong, spending 2 power and a patron action to get an agent for the next turn, that's a stiff price to pay for a card move. NPCs tend to use this patron only as needed and generally are not aggressive about turning Pelin just because he favors you. Next is the Grandmaster Hlalu patron, which allows you to sacrifice a card from your play pile in exchange for prestige. You absolutely can win a game by sacrificing cards to Hlalu. To go this route, prioritize cards that generate large amounts of gold and those that give an additional patron turn. Buy big every round and use the cards once they come to hand, and then unless they add strength to your deck somehow, sacrifice them to Hlalu. And if you claim contract agents, you can sacrifice those immediately. Several of the Hlalu agents and action cards allow you to claim cards that cost 6 or 7 gold, and using an extra patron turn to sacrifice 2 of those in one hand can mean 10 or more points in one hand. NPCs use the Hlalu patron if the deck is in play, but won't fight you for control of it if the patron favors you. Be aware, though, that sometimes an NPC gets aggressive about sacrificing cards. It's easy to overlook that they're doing it, and it can result in big jumps in points, so keep an eye out for that tactic when Hlalu is in play. Then we have the Crow patron, which converts all the gold you have into power, -1. A quirk of this patron is that once the crows favor you, you can no longer use their patron ability. So from the neutral position, you can do the gold to power thing one time, and then you are dependent upon your opponent turning it before you can use it again. That's exactly why I rarely touch it once my opponent has claimed it. Generally speaking, the longer a game of Crows goes on, the more gold both sides are able to generate in one hand, and therefore the more important it is to leave the dial alone if the NPC captures it. On the other hand, if you know you can generate huge stacks of gold every turn and they cannot, then turning the dial might be a good bet. The trick to knowing when to use this patron is keeping an eye on your respective gold availability each hand. The closer the average is between the gold generated by each player, the less of an advantage you'll get from using the patron, and the more risky it is that using it will hurt you. In my experience, the NPCs tend to use the Crow patron fairly early in the game, usually when they get 6 or more gold in one hand and don't have a high-cost card to buy. Usually after that, I leave it be. Then we move on to the Psijic Patron, which costs 4 gold and removes an opponent's agent from play. You won't be able to complete a patron victory if the Psijic deck is in play unless your opponent uses an agent. So if they do, seize the opportunity and destroy the agent as soon as you can. By the same token, you can never use agents of your own to prevent your opponent from moving the dial at all. I don't tend to use the Psijic Patron because I prefer other patron effects, but if you have gold and a problem with enemy agents, this is a tool in your toolbox that you can use. NPCs aren't shy at all about using the Psijic Patron against your agents if you have one out and they don't have any high-priority targets in the tavern to spend their gold on. Generally speaking, though, while they will use it, they won't fight you for control of it. Next is the Hunding Patron, which costs 2 power and gives you 1 gold immediately. Additionally, you will gain 1 gold at the start of every turn as long as you retain the patron's favor. However, as I'm filming this, again January 24, the NPCs seem to currently have a no-tolerance policy on sharing Hunding's favor. I've said several times the NPC won't fight you for the favor of certain patrons. Here's one of the 2 reasons I make that distinction, because with this patron, the NPC absolutely will fight you for him. Once you turn the Hunding Patron, the NPC will turn him to their favor the instant they have 2 power, and they will keep doing that every single time you take him back. My plan is to always have gold enough of my own in my hand pretty quickly, so for me, giving up 2 power over and over to reclaim him never works out in the long run. So in my recent experience, using Hunding at all just means that at some point the NPC will be gaining a gold every turn for the rest of the game. Given that this is the way NPCs are currently playing this patron, my advice is just to leave him alone. Hey, this is Editing Cells breaking in to say that when I went into the game to get some footage of the Hunding tug-of-war that the NPC does, what I discovered is that the novice-level NPC tribute players do not do that nearly as aggressively as the expert players do. So you can certainly give it a try, but do know that that tug-of-war is something that can happen. And that's the end of the break-in. Back to past me. My advice is just to leave him alone. And yeah, that means no access to that extra 1 gold when it would be really handy to have it, but if you're playing the Reach deck like I suggested, you'll have another option. And as it happens, the Reach deck is next on our list, so let's talk about that. Using the Reach deck patron costs 2 power and gives you an additional card draw from your deck. At a bare minimum, that'll be 1 gold or 1 power, but it might be a lot more if it adds to a combo. In fact, as a rule, when you are done destroying coin and writ cards, and you're asking yourself what else should go, think about whether or not you'd be willing to pay 2 power to use the Reach Patron to draw that card. If the answer is no, burn it. Remember that before using the Reach Patron, or any other draw a card ability, that you can look at your draw deck to see if there are useful cards still in it. If not, don't spend the resource to draw the card. NPCs will freely use the Reach Patron, but won't fight you for him. And now the Sea Elf Patron. I always want to be honest, so I gotta say, I don't love how this patron ability works. Before I get into the why of that, as a bonus mini-tip mixed with a confession, I'll point out that you can forfeit a tribute game at any time. And I do, every single time an NPC picks this deck, right during deck selection. No one from the Roysters Club has ever once shown up to chastise me about it. So remember that bailing is always an option. Life's too short. Forfeit during deck selection if the NPC's choice enrages you. Forfeit during the game if an NPC makes lucky tavern buys and you just don't want to deal with it. Think of it as mental health self-care. And thus concludes the bonus mini-tip. Now let's talk about this patron ability. Using the Sea Elf Patron costs 3 gold and gives you an amount of prestige based on the number of cards in your deck, and if the player activates the patron when they already have his favor, it generates a new card that's added to the player's deck. That means if you let your opponent keep the favor of this patron, the benefit quickly snowballs beyond recovery. It is therefore imperative to keep an opponent from controlling the Sea Elf Patron. You probably already know how this deck works. Pretty much the first person to use the patron will win the game as long as they can hold on to him after that. If this deck is in play, you have 1 or 2 hands before the NPC turns the patron, definitely not more than 4, so you have to act quickly. Once the patron has been turned, the NPC will continue to activate him every hand, gaining prestige and possibly another card, and you will have to respond by turning the patron back, and that's how the rest of the game will go. That means more than any other single patron, the outcome of a Sea Elf game is determined by luck, because what cards are in the tavern during the first few hands makes such an impact. If you frequently play the Sea Elf deck, and one of the problems that you have with Tribute is that it's too luck-based, that's probably why. Based on what you can grab those first couple of hands, here are 2 possible tactics. If you can get high power cards, then don't concentrate on the Sea Elf Patron. Instead, destroy cards as you can in order to maximize the appearance of those power cards and buy new power cards whenever possible. Or 2, cards that generate gold make it easier to control the Sea Elf Patron, so if you can grab one of those early on, immediately do so and then take the patron. From then on, buy an additional card whenever you can, preferably a card that also generates gold, but always reserve 3 gold to use the patron after. Rinse and repeat until you strangle the NPC. Win the game. With this tactic, you never want to destroy cards, since the patron's ability gives you more power the larger your deck is. Instead, it's the opposite. Always buy as many cards as you can, pretty much whatever they are, in order to pad your deck. Now, your mileage may vary on this, and seriously, if you love this deck, I'm sorry for grumbling about it. Please tell me what I'm missing in the comments, because I'd love to fall in love with it. I'm just not there right now. And finally, Regine. Using the Regine patron costs 3 gold and adds a bewilderment card to the opponent's deck. If you despise this deck, the bewilderment cards might be why. If so, remember that if you're using the Reach deck and destroying trash cards as you go, getting those bewilderment cards out of your hand is not as big a deal. Give the combination a try and see what you think. By contrast, however, while the NPC will destroy a bewilderment card if they can, if they cannot destroy it, they will pay 2 gold to sacrifice it to the bank in exchange for a writ. Now that's a technique you can use too if nothing else is available, but, I'll say again, you'll do better if you concentrate on destroying those cards, even if it means having one show up in your hand a couple of times before you can eliminate it. Remember, the writ cards are a stopgap and will need to be weeded out of your hand eventually as well. Yes, 2 gold is better than nothing, but it spends a game action and it turns a card you want to destroy into another card you want to destroy, and it takes a patron turn. If you can't destroy the bewilderment card, you're usually better off doing something else with your 2 gold in your patron turn that will strengthen your deck. However, because the NPC consistently does it that way, means that every bewilderment card you throw at them potentially slows down their progress, drains their gold, prevents them from using another more useful patron ability, and because it also stuffs their hand with writs as a side effect, it limits the combos they can create. In short, if you are already used to destroying trash cards, you can exploit the ability of the Regine patron much better than the NPC's AI can, so take advantage of that. Generally speaking, NPCs often, mostly, usually but not always, don't turn the Regine patron first, so if you hate bewilderment cards, know that it is possible to use this deck and go a whole game without them. And that ends the patron review. I mentioned earlier I'd be discussing the balance of knowing what cards to prioritize during your turn, and we're now heading into tip number 4, which is the framework I use to decide priorities. Tip number 4 is that most tribute games go through stages, and the priorities change during each stage. The most effective actions you take, which cards to buy, which patrons to use, depends on the stage that you're in. Please understand this is not official in any way, it's just a framework I came up with to use. I realized that the priorities change in a pretty consistent way over the course of the games, so I started looking for markers of how to know when the game was changing direction. My framework is that most games have 4 stages. I call them, not inventively, the gold, deck building, deck culling, and power stages. During the first stage, gold is the priority. At the start of every game, your opening hand will have 3 to 5 gold to spend. The second player gets an extra gold to start with, so it's possible that person will have 6 gold in their first hand. It's likely a few hands will pass before either player has 6 gold again, and cards that cost 6 gold or more tend to be very powerful. If you are the second player and happen to get that 6 gold, you'll probably want to grab a card that costs 6 gold if it's available. If there's a super strong card in the tavern, like the Armory, then sure, grab that puppy. But otherwise, your top priority in those first few hands is to grab cards that generate gold. The goal during this first stage is to be able to generate 6 gold in one hand reliably, so that you can buy those more expensive cards. In that hypothetical first hand where you are the second player with 6 gold, if you can grab the Armory, sure, but in a situation where you're looking at, for example, spending 6 gold for an agent who does not generate gold versus buying 3 cards for 2 gold each that generate 2 gold each, then during this early stage of the game, you'd be better off buying the 3 cheap cards that generate the gold, because it gives you a better chance of getting 6 or more gold in one hand later on. What's ideal in those first few hands is to buy a single card that generates 3 or 4 gold. It's also super helpful to be able to grab any agent that generates 2 gold. What I'm calling the gold stage doesn't last long, maybe even just a couple of hands. The score might still be in the single digits when it ends, which is when you have purchased enough gold-generating cards that you can reliably generate 6 gold in a hand with the occasional chance of getting 7 or 8 gold. Maybe not every single hand, but you've got the cards for it. The exact mix of cards that can get you there will vary, but if a card in the tavern costs 6 gold and you know that you'll be able to buy it within a couple of hands, then you're at the end of the gold stage. Which puts us into stage 2, the deck building stage. At the point where you feel like you can reliably buy cards, the next question is, which cards? For the scope of this video, it's impossible to go into every possible strategy or scenario, but we'll go through a highlight reel of what to watch for. During this stage, your emphasis is on buying cards that will strengthen your deck, but even so, remember your goal is not a large deck, it's a powerful one. If you aren't used to destroying cards, then, probably, you've tried to improve the ratio of bad cards to good in your deck by aggressively buying as many cards as possible. Try and guard against that impulse, and instead destroy weak cards instead of burying them under meh cards. Weak cards are cards that don't contribute to combos, just dilute your deck. I believe NPCs must buy a card if one is available that they can afford, and that is a weakness of the AI. Also remember that if you leave a bunch of trash in the tavern, the NPC will have to spend their gold clearing it, and then they might not have enough gold to buy any good cards that deal into those spots. To return to my stages of the game thing, the difference between the gold stage and the deck building stage is that you now have options, whereas in the beginning you had little gold and little card availability. You had to grab what cards you could, and the NPC was doing that as well. Now both of you have messy decks with cards purchased at least partly out of necessity, yet those cards set up the direction for the rest of the game. For example, you may have a lot of a particular suit, which will drive you to prioritize that suit going forward. Or you may have a few power cards and decide that destroying all other cards in your hand as fast as possible is the way to victory. Having gold gives you room to apply strategy, but that strategy has to be grounded in the cards you already have. So once you're able to spend 6 or more gold in a hand, stop and take a look at the cards you have and think about your possible strategies going forward. It might seem impossible to form a strategy based on a few cards you've just grabbed after a few hands in, but the earlier you can decide on a tactic, the better. Having said that, you do have to respond to what drops in the tavern, but because you can't count on what you might get, that just means it's more important to learn to form a strategy with what you have as fast as possible. And as a relevant side note, if you're thinking that there's no way to make a plan because the tavern is random and you're at the whim of fate with card choices, I have good news. In addition to offering a number of ways to destroy cards, the black deck also contains a number of cards that remove cards from the tavern. They are low-cost cards, and the NPC will buy them and clear cards continuously. So when the black deck is in play, you'll have a far greater number of choices with regard to card buying, and therefore, more chances to consciously build your deck. Getting to that, here are the things you'll want to be looking for when buying cards. It's so obvious it's hardly worth saying, but any card that generates 3 or more power with no combos is always a priority no matter what suit it is. Yes, buy the armory. That is the kind of high-quality advice you tuned in for, am I right? As I said previously, destroying weak cards is preferable to shuffling them around. So in general, avoid buying deck manipulation cards and instead spend your gold on cards that are strong in their own right, instead of just being a way to get a good card. When buying or removing a card from the tavern, you open a spot. Ask yourself if it's worth giving the next card to the NPC if it happens to be a good card. Only buy cards that are worth that risk. However, removing cards from the tavern is an excellent strategy if you don't want them in your opponent's hands. Sometimes the card in the tavern already is the worst case scenario, and it doesn't matter what you replace it with. Remember too that you can look at your opponent's draw pile in hand. It may be that they don't have enough gold to buy the card you're worried about anyway. One specific note about the Hounding deck: the power cards are obviously good investments, but the cards that offer a choice between getting gold or power are fantastic investments as well, because they are powerful during all stages of my gameplay. They help early with gold, but they don't need to be destroyed mid-game when condensing for power. Always grab them if you can. I know the Crow deck is popular, so I have several notes about buying cards for combo-heavy decks, some specific to the Crows. Combo-heavy decks, especially the Crows, require buying all the cards you can in that suit as early as possible. Make them a consistent priority, particularly the Crows. Some Crows have a combo 4 ability, so you have to play 4 Crows over the course of one hand to take advantage of the ability that you paid for. That means more, smaller cards can be better in the beginning instead of a few large, powerful cards with combos you can't trigger. Can't say it enough with Crows. It's a flock or nothing. Don't dabble. In general, but especially with the Crows, prioritize draw another card abilities over all others. With Crows specifically, if you're in the gold or deck building stage, buy cards with the +1 that also give gold. If you're in the deck culling stage, buy the +1 cards that also give power. All combo decks benefit from 2 things you should try and do whenever you can. 1. Buy agents, which contribute to your combos, and 2. Keep destroying the weakest cards from your deck, which eliminates the trash that stops combos from happening. As the deck building stage progresses, resources will no longer be a problem. You'll be able to buy what you want, and then you'll shift to buying only cards that generate power. Be more and more picky about what you add to your hand, and if you don't like what's in the tavern, use removal cards to clear spots and see new options. Once you have cards that support the strategy you're pursuing, lean in more and more to destroying everything else. After the coin and Rick cards are gone, start destroying cards that only generate gold in favor of those that generate power. The shift where you're fully prioritizing the destruction of the chaff in your deck is the shift between the deck building and deck culling stages. Your ultimate goal is for your deck to be a small, tight stack of awesome. You may have noticed as I covered cards to grab, I didn't mention the bank contract cards that directly give power. That's because I don't actually recommend buying them until you are in the deck culling stage, and only then if you don't have an option to destroy cards. I know that seems wrong, but the deck building stage really is about getting the fewest, most powerful cards into your deck as fast as possible. The one-time contract cards that offer power don't build anything for you long-term. Yes, I am behind in points most of the games that I play because of this, but I swear I do win the majority of games I play against the NPCs because of this. However, if leaving the bank's power cards to NPCs gives you too much trouble, then go ahead and buy them, but do try and shift away from thinking of them as a priority. As your hand continues to become more concentrated with power cards, you enter the last of my 4 defined stages, the power stage. I know, inventive names, yeah. At this point, most or all of the trash is culled, and you're putting enough power on the board each hand that the game ends pretty quickly. It is super fun to go from 20 points to 60 in 2 hands when a deck comes together. But I promised I wouldn't try to sell you on Tribute, so enough of that. I also promised this video would give you new tools to beat the NPCs in Tribute play. Before we head into the last tip, if you've picked up things you can use and you're active on social media, please consider sharing the video to Twitch or Discord or wherever it is that you hang out. The YouTube algorithm loves it when you share things, and the exposure really helps the channel since I don't spend a lot of time on social media outside of YouTube. I very much appreciate every bit of support. It really makes a difference to small channels like mine. And on that note, I am thrilled to announce that Tamriel Tidbits passed YouTube's thresholds, and I can now offer channel memberships. I'm still working out the details, but I'll announce them soon, and I'll activate the membership button when I do. I'm considering a monthly Tribute tutoring live stream for channel members, so let me know in the comments if that would be of interest to you. Stay tuned for more news, and again, thank you so much. I couldn't have made it to this stage without your support. And with channel news out of the way, let's head into tip number 5, which is that each deck has strengths and weaknesses. In this tip, I'll cover ways to use those strengths and weaknesses to both build your own strategies and counter your opponent's strategies. It will be a brief overview, but it will be a place to start once you're ready. I think by now you know I love me a good chart, and I've covered a lot of deck info already, so this section has some recapping, but put in terms of which decks support and counter each other. As a general statement about support decks, tip number 1 was about the Reach deck, and I'll put it in tip number 5 too. The Reach deck's card destruction ability improves combo decks, power decks, all decks except the Sea Elf deck. It is the ultimate support deck. In terms of other kinds of support that can benefit decks, the ones that have expensive cards like Pelin, Hunding, the Reach, and Regine benefit from gold-generating decks like Hlalu and Regine. The Crows can generate gold too, but not as quickly. The cheapest card in the Crow deck costs 4 gold, so in general it takes more rounds to get a lot of Crow gold into your hand at once. Additionally, agent-heavy decks with fragile agents, like Crows and Regine, can benefit from the protection of a high-health agent with Taunt, like are found in the Pelin and Hunding decks, but those are a challenge to handle if your opponent claims them. Conversely, the ultimate counter to most decks is the Regine deck. When you feel you've got a handle on deck building and deck culling and you want to start actively planning counters to your opponent's tactics, I'd suggest you start by learning the Regine deck. It can gum up the works for any deck, but especially for Pelin, which is a problem deck for a lot of players. And as an added benefit, once you learn to use the Regine deck well against the NPCs, it will be much harder for living people to use it against you. Countering most decks primarily involves 3 things: removing cards from the tavern so your opponent can't get them, destroying important agents, and reducing an opponent's prestige after they've gained points. The Regine deck has cards that lower your opponent's prestige. Keep an eye out for cards with the blue hexagon. Those are the ones that steal points. Additionally, it allows you to create the Bewilderment cards, as we've already discussed, and those foul up every deck strategy except the Sea Elf Patron win. If you don't like the Regine deck, the Reach and Psijic decks give you the options for controlling the tavern, and the Unsuited Bank deck contains cards that will remove agents from play, so use all of those to your advantage. However, besides the Regine deck, there is no way in the base decks to reduce an opponent's prestige or put cards into their deck, and only the Regine deck has cards that take out 2 enemy agents without spending any gold or power. A note about countering the high power decks specifically, like Pelin or Hunding. Power decks can act quickly, so you're better off not using decks that take time to build, like combo decks, and especially not the Crows. It's way too easy to lose to Pelin while waiting for your flock to gather. Consider instead a faster strategy, like sacrificing cards to the Hlalu patron. That requires having gold, so gold decks can be good counters to power decks. Either use the gold to buy high-value cards to sacrifice to Hlalu, or use the gold to buy the power cards and then destroy everything else in your hand. And that, my darlings, is the end of my 5 tips. I really hope it helped you and that Kishka's dailies are less painful than they were. If that's true, please consider subscribing or liking the video if you haven't already, but regardless, I appreciate that you listened to the end because watch time is love too. So thanks for watching. Good luck on getting that music box lead, and until next time, may all your loots be lead.